Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Today's episode is a historical documentary blended with a personal reckoning and a cultural warning, and it's been sitting with me for a long time. 6 months, maybe more. I've got notes in the book margins here, tons of screenshots, quotes stacked in my notes folders on my phone. Books half highlighted and folded pages have been revisited time and time again. And when I thought I was ready to write it, every time I sat down, I wasn't. Because, this isn't really about history. It's about a story that we keep repeating with confidence, that Christianity saved the West, and what happens when you actually slow down to examine that claim. The claim that Christianity civilized Europe, that it gave us human rights, pluralism, rational inquiry, and restraint. And if Western civilization feels unstable today, then the prescription is simple. Return to Christian moral supremacy. And I find myself increasingly tired of hearing it. I'm tired of watching Judeo-Christian values, quote unquote, invoked as shorthand for liberty. Tired of hearing that our freedoms, our intellectual life, our legal architecture all flow directly from the Bible. Tired of the way that paganism is casually used as a synonym for barbaric or ego and denomination, while Christianity is cast as the moral counterweight, the conscience that civilizes power. And a recent example sharpened that fatigue. Leighton Woodhouse published an opinion piece in the New York Times titled "Donald Trump, Pagan King." And the framing was familiar and rhetorically smooth. Paganism was associated with this fierce appetite, unchecked authority, and Christianity, of course, is the restraint, humility, moral seriousness. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Whatever is broken in politics represents a departure from Christian virtue. And the structure of this narrative is ancient. Pagan equals raw power, and Christian equals moral discipline. But, this framing rests on an assumption that deserves far more scrutiny than it receives. It assumes that Christianity is the moral software of the West. Before it, there was chaos. But after, it was civilization. And so the deeper I've gone into late antiquity, through Catherine Nixey's The Darkening Age, Charles Freeman's analysis of the intellectual narrowing, Ramsay MacMullen's documentation of coercive conversion, and through primary sources, both Christian and pagan voices, that tidy civilizational story begins to unravel. Because when Christianity gained institutional dominance, what followed was not the natural flowering of pluralism and inquiry. It was the very opposite. And for us to truly understand, we're going to have to begin this story before Christianity held power. A world before monopoly. The Greco-Roman world was not a utopia. It had power structures that were often violent and deeply unequal, but it operated within a religious and intellectual framework that functioned very different than exclusive monotheism. Roman religion was additive rather than subtractive. One could honor household gods, civic gods, the imperial cult, foreign deities, and philosophical conceptions of the divine without renouncing the others. Orthopraxy, which is the practice, mattered much more than orthodoxy, which was the doctrine, just knowing what to believe. It was actually practicing what you preached, was so much more important. What counted was correct ritual performance, not the exclusive beliefs. The Pax Deorum, which means the peace with gods, was maintained through observance, not doctrinal conformity. Philosophically, multiplicity was the norm. Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics, Platonists, they argued openly about cosmology, ethics, and the nature of reality. Protagoras could admit uncertainty about gods without being erased from the record. Cicero articulated natural law grounded in reason and universality long before Christianity gained political authority. Debate was public. Rhetorical training, like the skill of rhetoric, was a civic skill. Argument was like oxygen at the time. The Roman legal system developed sophisticated structures of administration and legislation that would profoundly shape Western law. None of this depended on exclusive revelation from the Bible. None of this depended on the Old Testament 10 Commandments. But what it did come from was human reasoning that was operating within a plural environment. Rome suppressed what it perceived as politically dangerous. It was capable of cruelty, but structurally, it tolerated metaphysical competition. Truth was not framed as a singular and jealous, like in the way that later Christian orthodoxy would insist. Christianity did not enter this world as one more school of thought among many. It entered with a different moral architecture. Not, let's just add Christ to the pantheon, but burn down the rest. And that distinction is not merely cosmetic, y'all. It is the foundation to understanding real history. The Hebrew scriptures that Christianity inherited contain a reoccurring moral posture towards rival worship. Altars are to be broken down, sacred groves burned, idols smashed. You shall have no other gods before me. That's not a suggestion of preference. It's a declaration. Rival worship is not seen as a mere mistake. It is corrupting. When confined to private devotion, this posture functions as identity formation. Not that big of a deal. But when it's fused with state power, it moves from conviction to coercion. For the first 3 centuries of its existence, Christianity lacked authority. It survived as a marginal sect. For the first 3 centuries of its existence, Christianity lacked authority. It survived in the margins of society. And this decisive shift came when Christianity aligned with imperial power under Constantine and his successors. Estimates vary, but many scholars place Christians at roughly 10% of the empire around the year 300. The exact percentage is debated, but ancient demographic modeling is necessarily approximate, but the trajectory is clear. Within a few generations, that minority became the ruling faith. By the end of the 4th century, imperial law assumed Christianity as normative and increasingly treated rival rituals as illegal. Once this exclusivist theology acquired enforcement capacity, differences in beliefs was no longer merely an error, it was a threat. In the 380s and 390s, imperial edicts against non-Christian ritual multiplied. In 399, a Christian emperor issued a decree stating, "If there should be any temples in the country districts, they shall be torn down without any disturbance or tumult. For when they are torn down and removed, the material basis for all superstition will be destroyed." The language is bureaucratic, but the effect was not. These edicts provided legal cover for demolition. Bishops lobbied rulers for stricter laws. Congregations became the demolition crews. Rival worship was framed as superstition, whose material foundation had to be eradicated. As Ramsay MacMullen demonstrates, once rival belief is conceptualized as spiritually dangerous, compromise becomes morally suspect. In a plural system, rivals are mistaken, but in an exclusivist system, rivals are demonic, and demons are not debated, they are expelled. And this is the mechanism, and it becomes visible in stone. Linked in the show notes blog is How Faith Superseded Reason in Christianity, and we kind of break down this whole concept in a past episode. But moving on, the destroyers and the image of wisdom. So once this theology fused with the imperial authority, enforcement did not remain theoretical. It moved outward into the public space. It moved into cities, and it moved into stone. Catherine Nixey opens the darkening age not with doctrine, but with this image. The choice is deliberate. The arguments can be abstract, but statues cannot. The Temple of Athena in Palmyra had stood for centuries. It was not a relic in a museum. It was part of a living civic landscape. Its columns had watched merchants pass through the city, soldiers march under banners, pilgrims move between worlds. Within it stood Athena, goddess of wisdom, of strategic intelligence, of disciplined thought. She represented more than devotion. She embodied the classical inheritance itself, philosophy, rhetoric, ordered reasoning, the cultivation of mind. When the destroyers arrived, what they attacked was not simply this stone, the statue. Nixey describes a man entering the temple with a weapon and striking the back of Athena's head with such force that the goddess was decapitated. The violence did not stop there. Her nose was sliced off, her cheeks crushed, her once composed face mutilated with intention. And yet her eyes were left intact, and those eyes still exist. They look out from a ruined face that once symbolized wisdom. And this is not accidental vandalism. It was theology enacted physically. The old gods were not to be debated, not to be reinterpreted, not to be absorbed into new meaning. They were to be neutralized. Their presence was dangerous. Their very existence was a threat to salvation. The word often used for this period is triumph. Christianity triumphed over paganism, but triumph over what? Over multiplicity? Over a world in which philosophical disagreement could exist without annihilation? Over the idea that wisdom might not be exclusive to one's own revelation? The violence at Palmyra was not isolated. Temples across the empire were damaged, repurposed, stripped of ornaments, or demolished. Some were converted into churches. Others were dismantled entirely. Sacred spaces that had once structured civic and religious life for centuries were rendered spiritually illegitimate almost overnight. And what makes the image of Athena more destabilizing is its repetition. In 2015, Islamic State militants bulldozed the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrod because it was deemed idolatrous. The reconstructed remnants of Athena were attacked again, beheaded again, and arms sheared off again. Different century, different quote-unquote scripture, different empire. Same logic. When rival sacred presence is conceptualized as contamination, destruction becomes purification. And this is not about equivalence between traditions. This is about structure. When any Abrahamic framework defines truth as singular, exclusive, and threatened by proximity to rivals, pluralism becomes fragile. And once that framework acquires political power, that fragility becomes enforcement. And enforcement doesn't stop at statues. If Athena represents symbolic erasure, then Hypatia represents the human cost. Hypatia of Alexandria was not an obscure mystic. She was a philosopher, a mathematician, and teacher in a city long known for its intellectual life. Alexandria had been home to the Great Library and to competing schools of thought for centuries. Hypatia occupied a visible position within that tradition. By the early 5th century, Alexandria had also become home to a group known as the Parabolani, Parabalani, often translated as the Reckless Ones. Officially devoted to acts of charity, they functioned in practice as the muscle for ecclesiastical authority. By some estimates, there were hundreds of them in the city. They were described as a terrorist charity, which is a strained oxymoron. These men at times, I'm sure, did good deeds, but they also sowed fear. Terror is the word used in Roman legal documents to describe them. Hypatia lived in the same civic space as these very enforcers. Her murder, which is so gruesome, was not random street violence. It occurred within the atmosphere that had been shaped by the escalating Christian authority and the shrinking tolerance for rival influence. When theology like this defines truth as singular and civic order as dependent upon that truth, intellectual figures that are outside of that structure will become destabilizing. She was stripped, she was beaten, and killed by a mob associated with this Christian zeal. Her death did not mark the beginning of the violence, but it did mark the normalization of it. Once difference is framed as corruption and corruption as emergency, the elimination of it becomes defensible. And this pattern appears again and again and again in late antiquity. Pagan philosophers were exiled, schools were closed, public debate narrowed. The Emperor Justinian would eventually close the philosophical schools of Athens entirely, but inquiry did not vanish overnight, but the atmosphere changed. What had once been competition became suspicion, and suspicion reshapes this civilization quietly before it reshapes it violently. One of the most revealing threads in the historical record is not the destruction itself, but the emotional atmosphere that made it possible. Demonology was not marginal superstition, it was structured perception. Pagan temples were described as being inhabited by these malevolent spirits. Sacrifices were not merely mistaken rituals, but demonic feast. The world itself became morally charged terrain. Christians wrote anxious letters asking if they could sit in the places that pagans sat, use baths that were used on feast days, drink from wells that were near deserted temples, eat food that might have been associated with sacrifice. This fear was not symbolic, it was visceral. Augustine's response? That it was better to refuse contaminated food with Christian fortitude, even if one starved, which revealed this hierarchy of values. Survival could be negotiable, but purity could not. John Chrysostom, that's spelled Chrysostom, his sermons described eternal punishment in sensory detail, rivers of fire, venomous worms, inescapable bonds, exterior darkness. Fear was not an incidental rhetoric. It was the point of the teaching. It was the basis. Fear was the root of it all. It trained the imagination to view error as catastrophe and proximity to rival beliefs as an existential threat. When fear becomes formative like this, pluralism becomes psychologically intolerable. And when that psychology is paired with law, the narrowing becomes institutional. So the destruction of statues and temples is visible, but the destruction of thought is much quieter. One of the most devastating aspects of this time was not merely smashing of the classic art, but the narrowing of what was considered worth preserving. The ancient Mediterranean world once contained the greatest concentration of written knowledge humanity had yet assembled. The Library of Alexandria, even allowing for scholarly debate about its exact size, symbolized an ambition towards accumulation. Knowledge was not singular, it was expansive. It was contradictory. It was messy. What remains of that intellectual inheritance is fragmentary. By some estimates, only 1% of Latin literature survives from antiquity. Entire authors are known only by name. Entire schools of philosophy survive only in hostile summaries written by Christian opponents. Whole lines of speculation disappeared, not because they were refuted, but because they were not copied. Copying is the survival, but back in these times, the people doing the copying increasingly operated within Christian institutions, and these institutions were the ones who preserved selectively. Stay clear of all pagan books, reads the apostolic constitution, and that warning doesn't sound casual. It reflects a moral anxiety about contamination. These texts were not seen as neutral. They were spiritually charged, and exposure to the wrong argument is dangerous. Celsius, one of the few pagan critics whose voice survives, accused Christians of discouraging inquiry. He mocked the posture. Do not ask questions, just believe. His tone is sharp and even sarcastic, but the anxiety is real. In Greek philosophy, reason was virtue. Inquiry was sacred. Faith, as an unexamined assent, was the lowest epistemic posture. Even Origen, writing within the Christian tradition, conceded the problem with striking bluntness, remarking that the stupidity of some Christians is heavier than the sand of the sea. The anti-intellectual reputation of early Christianity was not a later invention. It was noted by contemporaries. The tragedy of Democritus crystallizes this narrowing. Democritus, the philosopher often described as the father of atomic theory, wrote extensively across cosmology, mathematics, and ethics. He proposed a universe composed of atoms and void centuries before modern physics, and yet none of his works survive intact. Not one. What we know of his thought survives because it was partially preserved inside a single poem, which itself survived precariously through a single manuscript discovered in a German monastery centuries later. The physicist Carlo Rovelli, Rovelli, has called the total loss of Democritus's writing the greatest intellectual tragedy to ensue from the collapse of the old classical civilization. An entire philosophical lineage survived by accident. That should unsettle anyone who claims that Christianity simply preserved learning. Yet, monasteries copied text, and by copying, this was filtration. Texts that deemed dangerous or frivolous, obscene, or spiritually corrupt were less likely to be preserved. When a civilization narrows its moral boundaries like this, its archive narrows along with it. Charles Freeman, in The Closing of the Western Mind, argues that the most significant shift was not physical destruction, but this narrowing of acceptable modes of thought. Public philosophical debate gradually gave way to appeals to authority and revealed certainty. Disputes were settled by councils backed by imperial power. Orthodoxy was defined not by open inquiry, but by boundary enforcement. The world did not stop thinking overnight, but the conditions for free competition of ideas shifted. And once intellectual diversity contracts like that, recovery takes centuries. The martyr myth and the moral installation. So the martyr narrative sits at the emotional center of Christian self-understanding, and it does more than preserve memory. It defines their identity. The story is familiar. Early Christians were persecuted by a pagan empire. They were imprisoned, tortured, executed for their faith. They endured without retaliation. They did not conquer, they survived. There is truth in this, yes. The great persecution under Diocletian was real and brutal. Scriptures were burned. Churches were destroyed. Christians were imprisoned and executed. No serious historian denies that. What modern scholarship questions, though, is the scale and the continuality of this. Like, the most severe empire-wide persecution lasted roughly about a decade. Other persecutions were local, sporadic, and uneven across the regions. They were not a continuous 3-century campaign of systemic eradication. Martyr literature itself has expanded over time. Detailed analysis of saints' calendars reveals duplication, embellishment, and narrative layering. Some figures appear under multiple names. Some accounts contain anachronisms or miraculous flourishes that complicate their historical reliability. The historian Gem de Sacroix observed the later martyr literature increasingly displayed what he called a contempt for historicity. And that line matters because it signals a shift. Suffering was not only remembered, it was shaped. And shaped suffering serves a purpose. Once Christianity had aligned with this imperial authority, the martyr narrative didn't recede, but it hardened into interpretive insulation. The same tradition that now authorized temple closures and school shuttings still understood itself as historically persecuted. The story generates moral asymmetry. Whatever Christians do can be framed as a response, not denomination. And the function of this martyr narrative did not end in late antiquity. In modern apologetics, it often operates as proof. The logic runs like this. The apostles would not have died for something they knew was false. Early Christians endured torture rather than recant. Therefore, their testimony must be true. But willingness to suffer proves sincerity, not metaphysical accuracy. People across religions and all sorts of faiths have died for beliefs that contradict one another. So martyrdom establishes conviction, but it doesn't establish truth. And this is why the martyr story is so stabilizing for Christians. It allows a movement to wield authority while retaining the self-image of innocence. It transforms power into protection and critique into persecution. When temples were outlawed and philosophical schools shut down, the tradition exercising authority did not see itself as a conqueror. It saw itself as a guardian of truth under threat. And if you're always defending truth, then enforcement feels righteous. The last pleas for coexistence. One of the great tragedies of this period is the archive becomes overwhelmingly Christian. The winners preserve their own voices and the losing side survives only in fragments. But some fragments remain. Libanius, Libanius, was a pagan orator in the 4th century, and he watched as temples across the empire were damaged, repurposed, or destroyed. His speeches were not rantings of a fanatic. More like anxious observations of a man watching his world contract. He describes sacred spaces falling into ruin, rituals forbidden, property seized. He notes opportunists dividing temple lands for personal gain under the cover of piety. What Christian historians later frame as triumph, Libanius experiences as loss. And then there's Symmachus. In 382 Common Era, the Christian emperor Gratian, Gratian, ordered the removal of the altar of victory from the Roman Senate house. For centuries, the senators had offered ritual observances there before conducting civic business. It was not merely religious decoration, but it was part of Rome's public identity. And Symmachus wrote an appeal for its restoration. His language is remarkable for its restraint. He does not demand dominance. He doesn't threaten revolt. He just argues for coexistence. We look on the same stars, he writes. The sky is common. The same world surrounds us. What difference does it make by what pains each seeks the truth? We cannot attain to so great a secret by one road alone. It is difficult to imagine a clearer articulation of pluralism in the ancient world. He closes not with hostility, but with humility. We offer now prayers, not conflict. St. Augustine, he says that all superstition of pagans and heathens should be annihilated, is what God wants, God commands, and God proclaims. Well, Symmachus lost. The altar was not restored. The plea for multiplicity was overridden by certainty. This moment matters because it reveals a collision between two moral architectures. One sees truth as approached through many paths. The other sees truth as singular and threatened by rival proximity. Symmachus represents not pagan decadence, but civic pluralism. He's not asking to suppress Christianity. He was asking for coexistence. The answer he received is enforcement. That narrowing was not accidental, it was structural. The long return of pluralism. The narrowing of late antiquity did not permanently extinguish intellectual life, but it did change its conditions. For centuries, inquiry moved within theological boundaries defined by ecclesiastical authority. Councils determined orthodoxy. Deviation could be punished. Philosophical speculation survived, but often cautiously and often cloaked. What we now call the Enlightenment did not arise as a natural extension of Christian supremacy. It arose within the tension, sometimes quiet, sometimes explosive, with religious monopoly. Beginning in the Renaissance, Europe experienced a gradual rediscovery of classical texts. Manuscripts long buried in the libraries of monasteries re-entered circulation. Greek philosophy was studied not merely as commentary on theology, but as an intellectual inheritance of its own right. The recovery of classical thought did not instantly dissolve Christian authority, though, but it reintroduced plurality into the bloodstream of European intellectual life. The Enlightenment sharpened that reintroduction. Thinkers like John Locke articulated natural rights grounded not in revelation, but in reason and shared human nature. Locke's arguments for religious toleration did not emerge from biblical exclusivity. They emerged from a recognition that coercion in matters of belief corrupts both faith and civic peace. Montesquieu analyzed the separation of powers not as theological doctrine, but as structural safeguard against the concentration of authority. His framework was explicitly concerned with preventing tyranny, whether that was coming from the king or from the clergy. These ideas did not descend seamlessly from medieval orthodoxy. They developed alongside and often in resistance to the religious entanglement with state power. And when we reach the American founding, the tension becomes explicit. The framers of the Constitution were deeply literate in classical thought. They read Cicero. They read Tacitus. They studied Roman republicanism. They were steeped in Enlightenment political theory. They feared concentrated power, including ecclesiastical power. The Constitution contains no reference to Jesus Christ. It prohibits religious test for office. The First Amendment forbids establishment of religion and protects free exercise. That was not a casual omission. It was intentional architecture of the Constitution itself. The American experiment was not a biblical republic. It was a republic designed to prevent religious monopoly. Thomas Jefferson provides a particularly revealing case. He famously produced his own edited version of the Gospels, physically cutting out miracles and supernatural elements. The result, often referred to as the Jefferson Bible, retained ethical teachings, quote-unquote ethical teachings, barf, while discarding divine intervention. This was not the act of a man seeking to found a theocracy. It was the act of a man separating moral philosophy from revealed absolutism. Jefferson's project reflects a broader Enlightenment impulse to preserve ethical insight while disentangling it from exclusivist authority. Roger Olson's theological scholarship further complicates the claim that Christianity simply, quote-unquote, gave us pluralism. Olson emphasized that Christianity was never doctrinally uniform in its early centuries. Orthodoxy was consolidated through contest, suppression, and boundary enforcement. The unity later invoked as civilizational foundation was itself the product of that narrowing. The Enlightenment did not grow naturally from that. It reopened the debate. It reintroduced skepticism as a virtue. It separated church and state not to destroy religion, but to protect civic plurality. If Christianity had already secured pluralism, the Enlightenment would have been unnecessary. The fact that it was necessary tells us something profound. Pluralism survived not because exclusivity reigned, but because exclusivity was restrained. So in closing, did Christianity give us human rights? At this point, the most common objection surfaces. Even if there was access, even if there was a narrowing, even if temples fell and texts disappeared, Christianity still gave us the concept of human dignity. Christianity laid the groundwork for human rights. And that claim, it sounds intuitive because Christian theology does contain a powerful moral idea that humans are made in the image of God. The idea has inspired reformers and abolitionists and activists. It matters. But the existence of moral language is not the same thing as institutional pluralism. The Stoics articulated a form of universal human rationality centuries before Christianity held power. Roman law developed ideas of legal personhood and universality that would influence later legal systems. Cicero's natural law did not depend on revelation. Christianity contributed to moral discourse. That is true. But the institutional protection of dissent, the right to disagree publicly, to publish heterodox ideas like brand new ideas, to worship differently without legal annihilation, did not emerge during the period of Christian monopoly. Those protections developed when religious authority was structurally limited. Rights require restraint of power. And historically, the moments when Christianity was most fused with state authority were not moments when pluralism expanded. And what this feels like from the inside, because what's the most unsettling about this history is it's not simply that it happened. It's that I recognize the same mechanism. I've lived an internal version of it. Burn the books, throw away the tarot cards, remove your New Age spirituality material, avoid contamination of demonic entities, guard the mind, monitor the thoughts, stay pure. When you inhabit Christianity long enough, the anxiety internalizes. You become your own enforcer. You police your own curiosity. You treat rival ideas not as intellectual challenges, but as spiritual threats. When I read about Christians in late antiquity asking whether they could sit where pagans had sat or drink from wells near deserted temples, it was too relatable. The narrowing does not begin with demolition crews, but it begins with fear. Fear reshapes perception. Fear shrinks curiosity. Fear frames differences as danger. Scale that fear across institutions, and you have late antiquity. Scale it across a nation, and you have something far more consequential. And this is why rhetoric of a Christian supremacy unsettles me. Not because Christianity has contributed nothing to Western civilization, because I have to admit it shaped art, music, law, charity, moral imagination. That's undeniable. Much of this period is still narrated as civilizational triumph rather than suppression. As the academic John Pollini, Pollini, notes, modern scholarship, influenced by a Judeo-Christian cultural bias, has frequently overlooked or downplayed such attacks, and even at times sought to present Christian desecration in a positive light. But the claim that Christianity saved the West collapses complexity into myth. It erases the plural foundations of Greco-Roman thought. It erases the Enlightenment's deliberate separation of church and state. It erases the long struggle to restrain religious monopoly. Reformers like John Calvin did not argue for a secular state. In his Institutes, Calvin insisted that magistrates had a duty to suppress blasphemy and false worship. Pluralism did not emerge from this sort of supremacy. It survived by limiting it. So when modern commentators are framing Christianity as the sole guardian of civilization and paganism as this barbaric force, they repeat a frame older than they realize. They invoke a story in which exclusivity is equated with order and multiplicity with chaos. History suggests something different, though. Civilizations are stabilized not by monopoly, but by constraint. Not by erasing rivals, but by tolerating them. Not by conflating revelation with law, but by separating the two. And if we forget that, if we mythologize exclusivity as the foundation of freedom, we risk mistaking that narrowing for renewing. And that is not a mistake history makes gently. And that's all I have for you today, folks. And if you've been here for a while, you know that Taste of Truth Tuesdays is not about tearing down for sport, not defending tradition out of a reflex, but slowing down long enough to ask, is the story we're repeating actually true? And as always, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in.